Okay, one item that we can turn to, we are a little behind, but we want to stay on track and then get to lunch. But Megan Everett is the director of ULEAD, Utah Leading Through Effective, Actionable, and Dynamic Education. Brittany Cummins from the governor's office and I happen to be the current co-chairs of the steering committee there, and we've been watching Director Everett move into her role and move forward with the mission of ULEAD. So she's here to explain what's going on, and happy to have her. Thank you very much again for joining us, Director Everett.
Thank you. Off instead of on. Great. Thank you. Learning to use the screencast. I so appreciate taking the time to listen to what is going on with ULEAD, but more importantly, where we're going with it. And I realize I'm standing between you and lunch, and so I will talk fast. As Chair Moss mentioned, I'm Megan Everett, and I'm the director of ULEAD. I came on board in August, and I'm really excited to share what we've been doing so far. If you are not already familiar with ULEAD, it is a great acronym, Utah Leading Through Effective, Actionable, and Dynamic Education. And this was created in legislation in 2018 and then revisited last year in 2022 with 4 big goals. So the first one is to initiate and disseminate research on innovative and successful practices that are happening in Utah, because we hear a lot about what's great in education, but so often teachers want to say, well, what about Utah schools and what is happening in Utah and my next door neighbors? So that's where we focus. Also, to curate and explain other research that is happening and to put those together into a clearinghouse that is really responsive to educator needs and the information that they want to hear. Then connect people with that, because if we just leave it to sit somewhere, nobody engages with it, and that's not so useful. So to connect those experts in areas of practice to the educators and what's going on in our state, and then finally to report on what those practices are, and specifically to talk about how we can remove barriers so that other people can replicate those great practices. So this is kind of that's the legislation of ULEAD, but this is what it is in a practical sense. So what does the data tell us is going well? Where are these positive outliers and bright spots? Then let's go learn from their practice. What are they actually doing day in and day out to be so successful? How can those practices be adapted and replicated? What else would you need if you wanted to take that same practice and put it into your school or to your LEA? And then connect and share people to have discussions about that work and learn from what people are doing. So when I joined ULEAD, we said, where are the entry points for this process? What does this look like if we were to systematize it? And this is what we came up with. So ULEAD has a steering committee, which Chair Moss is a co-chair of as a member of the board. Brittany Cummins, who's the advisor for Governor Cox, is also on there. And then we also have representatives from USBE, but most importantly to me, superintendents, teachers, and principals that are representing both public and charter schools that are telling us about what's going on in their schools and in their communities and what we're hearing from them. And then of course we get input in other ways, such as the engagement survey or information that is being collected across the state. All of that information goes into making the ULEAD focus priorities that we'll go after for a certain amount of time. And it's actually pretty aggressive in terms of a research schedule to look at those over the course of a year and see what we can take from them. That doesn't mean that those are the only things we investigate. That just means where our focus lies. So once we have those priorities, we move to research. And we make connections to other research that exists. We help develop it along the way, but you see research in the middle because that is the big focus. How do we find the practices that are going well and make them replicable for others? And then of course, you would have to communicate and engage people with that so that they would be able to use it. All of that goes back to the field, which in turn comes back to us. So if you look at the ULEAD repository, there in legislation says that we will produce innovative practice reports. So that's really the bread and butter of what we're putting together. Those reports are pretty detailed. They talk about what is the data that says this is going well? What is the practice? How can it be adapted? I think the most important piece here are these templates or tools. So if we go to a school and say, how are you so successful in science, for example, and they say, oh, it's our PLC process. And then they're able to share with us the PLC template or the protocols that they use to have those discussions. Those are really important for the practice reports so other people can see it in action. We do include other information, so policy and practice briefs, things that are smaller and more bite-sized to look at or just give an overview. And then also combined reports. So if we were to do that in 10 different LEAs, we can also put them all together and look for themes across them of how they're able to achieve success. Engagements we have coming up, and I'll just talk about these briefly because I'll mention them again, but ULEAD has looked at things that have gone well and asked people how they got there. Innovation cohorts provide an opportunity to learn with them as they're putting it into practice so that as things are becoming great practice, we're right there with them helping them measure. And that's a little bit easier than saying, hey, what'd you do the last 5 years that was so great? Practice summits where we can engage with experts and practitioners in the same space. Practice webinars, which would be similar, but obviously online or recorded, and then listening sessions where we get to talk to practitioners or bring together a group of principals or a group of teachers to talk about these practices they're doing. We work with a really wide variety of people, so the steering committee, as I mentioned, is really important to driving our priorities forward. We work with higher education institutions, and recently have been talking to the different education deans in the state to understand how we can help each other in researching these items and make sure we have an objective outside point to look at some of this work. We work with researchers, both in institutes of higher education and then in other institutions, so like the Data Research Center, for example, Utah Research Center. USBE, clearly housed here and work with the great experts and information available. Professional organizations, and you think of like Utah Teacher Fellows or the STEM Action Center and other groups that are interested in finding these practices. And then, of course, at the heart of it, practitioners in the schools. So you might say, I know this other group is doing this. I know teaching and learning is as a piece of this, or I know data and statistics does a piece, and they do. So I will tell you how ULEAD is a little unique. One is we collect massive amounts of data here, as I am sure you have seen, and we might look at it in a different way. A lot of times we're looking at that data to find where do we need to plug holes, and in ULEAD's instance, it's really great. We look for sunshine and roses, what is going really well, but we can pull from the same information. Obviously, there's a lot of reports written and disseminated. Ours are really focused on Utah practice and educator actions in the schools and LEAs. The repository is more dynamic, or intentioned to be more dynamic, than what just a website would be. So it's searchable and very practitioner-based and very accessible. And then, of course, we engage with practitioners. And I don't think there's ever enough of that. So if somebody else is doing it, awesome, great. And I tell you this because moving to our focus topics, you're gonna hear things that you say, oh, other people are doing that work too, and they are. We just might not be doing it in quite the same way, or we might have places where we can work together. So right now, our steering committee has identified these 4 focus areas, and it's not limited to these. But we're looking for what are the practices leading to teacher job satisfaction? What are those practices leading to strategic engagement with technology that's being really successful? What are practices that are driving attendance forward? That's a big one where you'll say, yes, other people are trying to do that too. And what are those classroom practices that are supporting students in academics, but that might not be the pedagogy or that teaching move? We use a lot of different things that are going on at USBE, so being housed at USBE and having the opportunity to work with the board and the departments is really important. We draw from the same pools of data and can rely on those experts. We hear from topics that are important within the building as well. We can use existing research and practices and policies to inform our work, and there are sometimes reports. I was reading a really great technical manual that we have, and it says these great things that we're doing, but it's not as detailed in the day-to-day practice. So we can draw from that, but then go find that practice piece. We engage with conferences that we have, such as the Rural Schools Conference you heard. We're engaging in newsletters and media and putting our information out. So if we have great resources for leadership, then maybe our leadership team shares that with them. We attend meetings like this one, or I've had an opportunity to share this with our leadership council. And then ULEAD is named in additional legislation, often in ways that will help us get to those innovative practices. So with the innovation grants in the sandbox, we're looking at when people try those out and they're successful, putting those into our repository of information. So like I said, I came on board in August. So a rundown of some of the things we've done and where we're going. We did an internal program audit to kind of figure out where our holes were, created a logic model for the program because this hasn't been really systematized. So we want to do that and action steps to go forward. We've updated our steering committee. Some people roll on and roll off after 2 years, so it was time for that. We developed a communication and engagement strategy, which our steering committee gave feedback on just this week. And we've initiated or drawn on higher ed partnerships that have kind of already existed or are growing. Again, with an effort to kind of systematize, so we're always working together in a consistent way. We've identified our focus priorities, data sources for those, and are working in an ongoing way to find those outliers. The repository and development of that is the highest priority because if that information isn't there, it's really hard to engage people with it. So again, higher education partners drawing on research that's ready to go, new priority briefs and overviews of what those priorities are and what we really mean with them. And then we've seen a really big increase in practitioner submissions of them saying, hey, ULEAD, I have this great practice and data. Do you want to learn more about it? Which is really great to hear. Participating out in the community more. So UCTM, I attended the last 2 days and got to talk with practitioners about our mathematics summits that we've held and some of the work we've done there. With USET coming up, we're hosting a highlight hive where LEAs can share their innovative practices in a collaborative space, and then other and ongoing events. And then we're starting these listening sessions, which our steering committee was really excited about, the opportunity for teachers and practitioners to get together and talk from what they're seeing every day. Professional cohorts, we hope to start this summer and go forward. So as they're doing great things, we can draw on it. And ultimately, and I hope that the next time we talk, we'll have this in place, is we want to bring together a practice summit where it's less theoretical than a research summit, but has research expertise, but more research-based than random practitioner practice because we've drawn on those evidence practices and bring them together in a space to have conversations with a goal of timely and replicable resources. So that is the fastest overview of ULEAD you could have.
Thank you, Director Everett. That was fast, but full of great information. I was involved in early on with ULEAD, and I'll just say it's beautiful to see how this has been fleshed out. It was born and went right into a challenge with COVID, but you know, there was a lot of people that weighed in. Chief of Staff Young's been heavily involved, and the premise of this was that there's really no challenge for Utah education that can't be solved with the great things that are already happening in Utah education. The question is, how do you find and understand and explain those practices in a way that Director Everett's explained? And so some of the outreach to higher ed institutions where they're going to participate and help taking that objective look and going deeper at really, you know, there's so many people doing great things. Where are the people that are really cracking that nut in a way that you can put some research context but highlight them as a way to share? So I'm obviously I'm a fan, and I just want to thank Director Everett, but any questions or comments? Member Bogus, Member Lear?
I think Cindy's in between us.
Oh, I'm sorry. let me get back to my Bogus, Davis, Lear, and Earl. There we go.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Director Everett. Is that, yeah, I have to tell you, that is probably one of the best literal presentations I've ever seen. It's very well done. Thank you. So I just have a couple questions. One is, you use the terminology remove barriers. And as an educator, I hear that term used almost synonymously, and everyone means something different by it. What do you mean by barriers?
Sure. So I think we don't know exactly until we investigate these practices. But for example, if we were to talk to a school and they say, you know, we're achieving these results with an effective coaching cadre. So a barrier for a different school system may be that they don't have that coaching cadre to draw on. So thinking about ways that we can use coaches intentionally or strategically. Somebody might say, we've been able to do this, but it was through this bajillion-dollar grant. So a barrier there is funding. So I think it's really dependent upon what the actual practice is and how they've been able to be successful, and just identifying, hey, if you also want to take this practice and put it into action, these are things you're going to have in place.
Okay, thank you for that. So, I have two more questions, and hopefully you'll find them easy to respond to. So, just for context, I am a single educator. I work in 6 buildings that have 6 unique and different cultures. So when you use the word replicate, it causes me a little consternation because I know that my students and the cultures of these buildings are very unique. And I work in 2 buildings that are less than a mile apart in the same community, and they couldn't be more unique. And so tell me about replication, because I have not found replication to be a fruitful thing to do because my niche cultures and my students are so unique. And then I have one final question.
So I think you're right. I've worked in multiple schools and states that very unique. I think one way we're addressing that is ultimately we hope to have practices that are representative of all those spaces. So that's a long way to go. We're certainly not there yet. But so a school can go in, and the repository in the legislation says it needs to be searchable by context. So you need to be able to say, I am looking for other rural elementary schools with this kind of makeup, with this kind of demographic, these kinds of things. And so looking across that. So we look for like schools. So I'm looking for other rural schools that are able to do this, other urban schools that are able to do this, other schools of over 3,000 students versus a school of 100 students. So that is one way that we're addressing that.
Okay, thank you. And then the more you speak, the more questions I have, but I'm going to
great.
give up after this one.
I don't know if that's good.
So I've noticed in my tenure as an educator that you can have great strategies and great practice, but if they collide with the culture of the building, they're completely ineffective. How does ULEAD navigate that scenario where you can't install a practice because the culture is averse to it? And I'm not saying averse to the idea, just the culture in and of itself, like the people don't necessarily reject the idea. The culture itself can't integrate with it.
Sure. So one thing I failed to mention was replication is an option, but so is adaptation, right? So adapting. Adaptation. So somebody could take that and say, well, I want to do this idea, but I know I have this other piece that is going to come into play. So that's one option. Another element of that is ULEAD is not designed to be prescriptive or formulaic in any way in terms of saying this is something now you must do. It is purely providing information. So you as an educator can go in and say, I don't know how to address this issue. What are other schools like me doing in Utah? And you can read and get all those ideas. And then that connection piece becomes really important, because it's not just, maybe you're able to read it and take it off the page and it works for you, but maybe you do have these other questions or holes. And so we can, I think Chair Moss has referred to it as a statewide PLC model, where you can take that concern about the culture element or whatever is blocking you from being able to be successful there, and actually go talk to this school or this LEA that did it well and see how they were able to overcome some of those things, or if it was even a concern for them. So I think that engagement piece becomes really important when you address the realities of putting something into practice.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Davis.
Yes, thank you. First is a really quick question. The second might be a tiny bit longer. One is the fiscal note still 500,000 annually? It was in the beginning. Did it change last year? And the second is, are we only taking data that we already have, or are we've been asked by LEAs, no more surveys. No, don't bother us with all of your great ideas. So do we let them know if we are surveying for information or doing a webinar or having the teacher, whatever's, that they know it's 100% optional to participate? Or are we sending it from the organization without any understanding that it's totally optional to participate? And is it optional?
Sure. So to the fiscal note, I know that there is, and I'm sorry because I don't know all of the fiscal information. I know that there is a move to reduce that this year and going forward by I think 58,000. But it has been, I think it's 510,000. Yes, it's completely optional. Just as doing any sort of research or investigation in any school would be. We do draw on data that exists because if it already exists, we don't need to go survey or recreate, and we certainly don't want to. We don't want to add that to anybody. So for example, one of our priorities is attendance. We have maybe not one smooth system, but we have different ways to already kind of look at and investigate attendance. And then, yes, absolutely and completely optional in terms of participating in any sort of feedback or providing information on practices.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Let's see, we have Member Lear and Vice Chair Earl.
Thanks, and I have a series of short questions. I hope short. I'll try that. First of all, I may have missed the meeting. You're a newer USB employee, I think.
Correct, yes.
So help me just a little bit about your background. This intersection of business and education is sort of something I always sort of get baffled by. So I'm curious what your background is.
No, I love that. Thank you. So I actually have a master's in advertising and public relations before I went back to school to get a degree in education. And so I have a master's in, now a doctorate, but a master's in education. I began working at the what became the National School Turnaround Model in Alabama, and I was a state teacher of the year there. When we moved to Utah, I became a mathematics coach. And then the last 2 years, I've been at the U.S. Department of Education in a full-time school ambassador fellowship role that let me work in a lot of different ways. So I've worked on federal grant programs and also with the Office of Outreach and Communication and over 2 different administrations. So a lot of different pieces to that. And then in my doctorate, I combined what I was really interested in. So a passion and love of education and communication theory practices.
Thank you. That is an amazing background.
Oh, thank you.
We all want a second life, and that might be one of my third or fourth choices, so that's super interesting. Secondly, when I read the materials, they were kind of general and felt a little bit of kind of research speak. And you've given me one answer, but I wanted to have 2 examples of reports that, and you listed reports as one of the things your office is putting together. And so I'm curious, one of them you said is you're working on is attendance. Is there another practical example of one that your office is working on?
Sure. So educator strategic engagement through technology. And I actually had a really enlightening conversation with the STEM Action Center, and they are looking at research that, again, already exists, which is wonderful, right? That says, well, we have high users of technology that also have high achievement, low users or no users of technology with low achievement, but we have this weird pocket where people are not they're using it, not a ton, and they're still having this high achievement. So that says there's something really strategic going on there and intentional about those choices that they're making in the classroom and implementation that's leading to this success. And so we don't have it yet because it's new, but that's our intention, is to go find out what those things are.
That's super interesting, and I just realized maybe I need to just make an appointment, come talk to you for a half an hour.
I would love
and
that.
just kind of get a better information about this. But so 2 more just very short questions. You mentioned that you have this board of directors, and how often do they meet?
It is legislatively directed to meet at least quarterly. I do communicate with them more often, and for example, our initial discussion about setting priorities ended up needing a second meeting, as you can imagine.
So is that something that board members could attend on a occasional basis? To see what it feels like or looks like?
Why
or-
not?
I personally
Okay.
have no
I know
concerns about
nobody
that.
else wants any meetings. I mean, maybe that's.
If you would like to attend
I'm
additional
just-
meetings in your life, you are
I'm
more
just
than
curious
welcome.
how that looks. And then
sure.
the last thing is, you seem to suggest there's going to be, or there is a database of this information. So
Yeah.
is that available? Is it in the works? Where are you with that?
There is information that exists on the ULEAD website currently. It is not quite doing what it's intention to do, to be this really dynamic, responsive database of information, for a couple of reasons. One is current limitations of the website and how it can be searched, but we are rapidly doing a redo of the website from.
So eventually is
So
what you're saying.
eventually, yes.
Okay.
So
And
that's-
I'm good with that. It takes
Yeah,
a while.
so that's one piece, but there is information that exists there already. It's just maybe not quite in the vision of where we want to go forward.
And so my very last question, and I mean this seriously, somebody is gonna laugh, I know, but I mean it seriously. So if there's information, can board members, can the public, can anybody suggest what I'd really like to know about? One of the things that I think was missing in our recent favorite bill, SB 215, I've already forgotten the number, it's Freudian. There's no discussion about comparative achievement between private school students and traditional school students. Is that the kind of thing that somebody could suggest you do a study on, or you gather information about?
Sure, absolutely. So like I said, we have these focus topics that drive the bulk of our work. That doesn't mean that we'll ignore other information or needs. Focus priorities are also intended to be responsive. So our steering committee does direct a lot of that conversation, but even on the front page of the ULEAD site, there's a place to fill in a form and say, this is a topic of importance.
I'm interested.
And then, of course, beyond that, I live here. So emails, phone calls, stop by.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to ask those questions.
Vice Chair Earl.
Yes, I'm grateful to see the shift in this particular program, because originally it was intended to do what it's doing right now, and then it ended up just being a replication of research that was already out there somewhere, right? Which may have some valid, framework behind it, but the intent was to actually get information from local schools, local districts, and highlight the key things that were very successful in Utah, not, outward. So I'm very grateful to see the shift and to see this going back into those areas that are relevant to our districts and relevant to individuals, education professionals that are implementing right now. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'll bring it back just for one comment. I think a great question was brought up about limitations to replication. And that was something that the initial researchers and folks that advised on the creation pointed out, that, sometimes you'll see a great highlight and you'll say, well, let's go do that. And so part of even what was in the statute is to address limitations to successful replication or adaptation of a successful practice, which could include barriers arising from federal or state law, state or LEA policy, socioeconomic conditions, funding limitations. So that you don't just grab something and run with it. You have ULEAD's help in figuring out how would that apply here, or how might it not apply, and some of the things that Director Everett pointed out. So I think, the idea is you're looking at ULEAD right here, mostly, Director Everett. So there's not a big staff to implement. They don't encroach on other departments' ideas of what they're trying to do. It's basically to have a shovel in the spotlight and the ability to say, here's what's working and why, and so that then, LEAs or our office can look at that and say, hey, that might inform what we want to do, either at a policy level or implementation level, but they don't stray from that lane of understanding and analysis, stopping short of implementation, and that avoids some of these questions about, well, that might not be for us. And so they facilitate the discussion, and as Director Everett's moving that in, there is a clearinghouse, and so that was, there's some things up there already, but I think as was pointed out, they're somewhat thematic, and so some of these thematic questions could go funnel into that. The steering committee that Director Everett has assembled we kind of filter all that and say, okay, what are our top priorities? With the idea then that you say, okay, if we're looking at somebody who's successful in this area, who's doing it? And so not as much as a general survey question, but a really, again, with the acronym suggest, within the topic identified by the steering committee, who's really implementing technology in a way that's driving student success? Who's doing it and how are they doing it? And that becomes that tight question that ULEAD can sort of answer, where there's a whole lot of information out there that's, thematically organized, but who's crushing it in Utah and celebrate that success story in a way that can be learned from? Is that, Member Straight, is that your light or Carol's? Okay. Oh, gotcha, okay.
Yeah, and that's probably saved
Oh, and
us
then
an
we
hour.
got Member Wood. Sorry?
So it's probably a good thing that my speak mic doesn't work. Saves us some time. But anyway, I have spent some time with Director Everett, and I'm gung-ho, anxious, ready to go, but I backed off. And the reason I did is she's only been here since August, and it takes time to get things in line, but I'm very intrigued by the work and look forward to additional conversations. Thank you.
And members, feel free that those steering committees, we probably publicize those, and it's a great team. It's folks from the field that make up that steering committee, and so those are directed by Director Everett. Member Wood.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director Everett, for being here.
Thank you.
I would hope that as you look to barriers to implementation, you might look for barriers for innovation, because I think that's some of the concerns that we have now is what are the seat time requirements or the budget requirements? What are those barriers to innovation in our schools to reach student success? Also, as I was looking at the steering committee, I noticed that you don't have a parent representative on there. And I know many of these are probably parents, but it really does bring value to bring someone who's not educator-based to come in and say, here are the best practices that are happening in our schools or things that I'm not missing. So as you move forward and look at that, I would recommend a parent-specific role on that steering committee.
Thank you. If I could adjust that for a second, the
Please.
makeup of the steering committee is in the legislation, and so that's designated. But as a parent, I appreciate that as well.
We've got stomachs growling. Any further questions or comments? And I think I was trying to look back through the statute. I know there was somebody from a community member in the steering committee, but that's a good thing to re-examine and see who that person is. So any further questions or comments? Thank you very much, Director Everett. And with that, we will break for lunch for 30 minutes.
Actually, 30 minutes.
Actual 30 minutes.
not
So
30 minutes
1:20. All right.
Not 30